Is it Molly or?
It's me. I'm recording.
Oh, hey,
Oh, you are
hey, Molly.
recording. Are you, Molly, are you also like letting people in the waiting room?
Yep, I will be in charge of that.
Welcome everyone to Balkan Circle. Kirill is teaching right now, so he's not able to join us today. Jason, who's often my co-host, is actually presenting. So I will be your host today, and Jason will help me mediate the questions at the end. So essentially act as a co-host anyway. So for those who don't know me, my name is Mary Newberger. I'm a professor of history here at UT Austin. I know we're virtual, but I'm here at UT Austin. Many of us are. I am also the director of the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, which is sponsoring this event, along with the Department of History and the Institute of Historical Studies, and European Studies, who are all sponsoring this series. I often forget to mention that at the beginning. It's my pleasure today to introduce our speaker, who's Dr. Jason Roberts, often also co-host of this, filling in for Kirill this semester sometimes. Jason, I'm going to just call you Jason instead of Dr. Roberts because I know you so well, has his PhD from UT Austin in Germanic Studies with a portfolio in Religious Studies, and he's currently teaching. He has a joint appointment in the Department of Slavic and Eurasian Studies and the Department of Religious Studies. He's also the director and the mover and shaker behind the Initiative for the Study of Politico-Religious Ideation and Influence, which is doing all kinds of cool projects, working with our students here at UT. And his presentation today is part of a book project, but also part of the work of that initiative, I believe. Is that correct, Jason?
Yes, it is.
Okay, why don't you take it away?
All right. Well, let me try to do the complicated maneuvers of sharing my screen. Okay, you see the PowerPoint now?
Yeah, we do.
Excellent. Okay, thank you so much, Mary. And I'm very happy to be here again, 2 semesters in a row. I understand it was the result of a cancellation, but it was quite fortuitous for me. To sort of try out some of this material that is part of the book, as you mentioned, the book project, and the fruits of a lot of collaboration and some amazing collaboration with students. So 2 of them in particular deserve a special shout out. This semester, I have been working with an undergraduate from outside our department, Ansh Samdaria, who is a philosophy major who has agreed to read all of this the philosophy material that we'll be talking about in a moment with me, and basically is paid to disagree with me. If he doesn't absolutely believe what I'm telling him, he's supposed to raise his hand and tell an adult, and he's done an amazing job. And Sergio Glajar, who is here with us, who has been in a similar position in the past, was instrumental in making this possible, including in co-producing a introduction, critical commentary, and translation of the text that is at the center of this presentation. So, all right. This project does not directly involve a large cast of characters. Many of you will already know the Russian fascist ideologue Alexander Dugin, probably in large part thanks to his 4th political theory of 2009. Those of you who already know the text or know about it will likely also know that it is influenced by the esoteric fascism, yes, that's totally a thing, of Italian fascist philosopher Julius Evola, in particular his Revolt Against the Modern World, published in 1934. Dugin even titles his final chapter Revolt Against the Postmodern World. While Evola's influence on Dugin is well known and thoroughly researched, to the best of my knowledge, the question of his possible influence on Romanian fascist philosopher and ideologue of the Iron Guard, Nae Ionescu, has not yet been addressed. That's the core of this project. I propose that, like much of Dugin's thought, especially 4th political theory, Ionescu's legionary phenomenon or Fenomeno Legionar, is heavily indebted to Evola's revolt. Thus, the scope of this project, that is to say, what I need to prove, is quite limited. Doesn't mean it's easy, but I'm seeking only to demonstrate that Ionescu's legionary phenomenon relies on Evola's revolt enough to be considered part of the same esoteric philosophical school, which is called traditionalism. However, the implications of that claim, if I can demonstrate it, are far-reaching. So before I address some of those implications, a word about the text itself. The legionary phenomenon originated as a series of lectures or conferences, conferenze, as they're labeled in the text, which Ionescu delivered to a number of legionaries of the Archangel Michael, with whom he was detained in 1938 at a camp outside Miercuriaciuc. The text we have was not written by Ionescu himself, but rather was written down by a Father Palagice, a Romanian Orthodox priest and legionary himself, who was present for the lectures. Palagice's notes were published in exile in Berlin 2 years later in Buletinul Informativ, Informative Bulletin, an ad hoc periodical for legionaries in exile in Germany, as part of a tribute to Ionescu, who had recently died. Only in 1963 in Rome did Constantin Papanace publish the legionary phenomenon as a single volume. Odd as it sounds, having his works published from other people's notes was not unusual for Ionescu. Most of his books, if we can call them that, are in fact notes from courses he taught at the university. The few that aren't are themed collections of his newspaper articles. For example, Rosavunturilor or Compass Rose, which was a curated collection of his political and religious thought that was put together by Mircea Eliade in, I believe, 1937. Yes, the few that aren't are themed collections of his newspaper articles. Scholars unproblematically attribute the contents of the legionary phenomenon, to Ionescu. Both his rhetorical style and his fixation on the idea of collectivity leave little room for doubt. That's addressed in the forthcoming critical edition, by the way. It should be noted that when Constantin Papanace published the 1963 edition of the Legionary Phenomenon, he included a lengthy preface in which he suggested that the ideas expounded in the pages that follow could serve, in large part, as the basis for a systematized legionary doctrine. Granted, the decision would not have been Papanace's alone to make, but there is no mistaking the fact that he's suggesting that the legionary phenomenon is the closest thing available to a legionary manifesto. It's an important text that has gone remarkably untranslated, if I can call it that, for a long time. The one exception being 1999, it was translated into Italian. Finally, yes, I wanted to announce that Sergio and I are, I preempted myself. I have a note to announce the translation. Now to the comparison of the two texts. I argue that the legionary phenomenon resembles Evola's revolt enough not only to be considered as part of the same esoteric fascist philosophical school of traditionalism, but indeed to suggest that Ionescu modeled the legionary phenomenon directly on Evola's revolt. While Ionescu does not invoke tradition, the central concept of traditionalism, as a part of his argument, he develops his idea of collectivity and collective truth to fulfill the same purpose. The comparison, I believe, is conclusive, yet there are also differences between the texts. While both Evola and Ionescu see the East as bearers of transcendental truth, for Evola, this is only incidentally the case. In other words, yes, the West is decadent, while the East maintains truth and tradition. However, for Evola, it might just as easily have been the other way around. By contrast, Ionescu sees the superiority of the East not as incidental, but as geographically inherent. The West is tied to its decadent fate by virtue of its historical and geographical conditions, and the East has the choice to follow the West into oblivion or to embrace its own superior, geographically determined destiny. If this sounds suspiciously familiar to Dugin's Eurasianism and his fourth political theory, good. I think so too, but we'll get to that in a moment. Now the implications. If the legionary phenomenon is inspired by, or indeed even ripped off from, Ionescu was a notorious plagiarist, Evola's revolt, ripped off from Evola's revolt, that has implications for scholars of traditionalism in particular, fascism in general, and for scholars of the Iron Guard and Romanian fascism. The primary concern would be the relationship of traditionalist ideas to an actual real-life fascist movement. It may also be of interest to scholars who consider the works of Ionescu, as the borrowing I'm suggesting is only a small part of the pattern of uncredited borrowing and outright plagiarism with which he has been accused of. The difference in the incidental and inherent fates of the West also has implications. Both scholars of traditionalism in general and of Dugin in particular will be interested in the fact that Dugin thus becomes part of a pre-existing pattern and less of an outlier in his approach to traditionalism. In other words, he's not the only one who is doing this with Evola, and somebody was doing it before him. On a related note, our forthcoming translation is not the first translation out of Romanian. Italian fascist theorist and publisher Claudio Muti published a translation of Il Fenomeno Legionario in 1999. Dugin published Fourth Political Theory 10 years later. Moreover, Dugin could absolutely have read the Italian. He allegedly learned Italian just so that he could read Evola's Revolt Against the Modern World. The method is a comparison between Ionescu's legionary phenomenon and Evola's revolt. The comparison seeks to demonstrate direct reliance on Evola's revolt. My reasoning for this is that if I can demonstrate that Ionescu directly based legionary phenomenon on the paradigmatic work of a philosophical genre, namely traditionalism, then it's unnecessary to address the question of philosophy and genre separately. If it's plagiarism, then it also fits within the genre or some form of plagiarism. The comparison reveals similarities, but also at least one significant difference. I suggest that the difference between Evola and Ionescu is similar to the difference between Evola and Dugin. I make that comparison after I make the first comparison. Given the similarities between the two texts, it would be reasonable to hypothesize that Ionescu acquired a copy of Evola's Revolt organically somehow. He was well read, he studied in Germany. And that this alone could explain the inspiration for the legionary phenomenon. Critically, we know that the math for such a hypothesis works. Revolt was published 4 years before the legionary phenomenon, in Italian and 3 years before in German translation. It also works linguistically. Ionescu took his PhD in Germany and wrote his dissertation in German, so he would have had no trouble reading the German translation, even if his Italian wasn't up to the task of reading the original. Although that also seems unlikely, he probably would have been able to read the Italian. As it happens, however, we know that Evola and Ionescu met in person in Romania at Ionescu's lovely and well-appointed villa outside of Bucharest over lunch. We know this from the memoirs of Ionescu's close friend, co-editor and former student, Mircea Eliade, the incredibly influential scholar of history of religions from the second half of the 20th century, who spent most of that part of his career at the University of Chicago. Eliade was also in attendance at lunch. Furthermore, we can also establish a date of no fewer than 3 months prior to the delivery of the conferences of the legionary phenomenon at Miercurea Ciuc for the meeting based on an article in Evola's weekly column in Il Regime Fascista, an Italian fascist periodical. Evola was visiting Romania in order to write about the legionary movement and its leader, Corneliu Zelia Codreanu, for his column. He wrote a number of articles about it. They have been collected and published by Claudio Muti, the same one who published the Italian translation of Legionary Phenomenon, and by the way, the Italian translation of Dugin's Fourth Political Theory, under the title La tragedia della Guardia di Ferro, the tragedy of the Iron Guard, which you see on the screen. So, Evola's traditionalism is my basis for comparison. So what is it? For those of you, if you don't already know, this is the esoteric fascist philosophical school. In brief, traditionalism claims the existence of an original, objective, transcendental model for civilization from which all existing civilizations have, to one degree or another, degenerated in an unending metacycle of decline and regeneration. It is decidedly anti-modern, anti-scientific, anti-democratic, as well as patriarchal, clerical, monarchical, and imperial. There are some useful distinctions between Guénonian traditionalism, named for René Guénon, who started it, and political traditionalism, which has been associated with Julius Evola. However, this study is not concerned with so-called Guénonian tradition, but rather specifically with Evolan. The book cover on the slide is from Benjamin Teitelbaum's 2020 War for Eternity, The Return of Traditionalism and the Rise of the Populist Right. On the cover, you see Julius Evola and Alexander Dugin, as well as the living, although older than pictured, Brazilian traditionalist Olavo de Carvalho, and our own Mr. Steve Bannon. Teitelbaum spent years gaining access to these men, except Evola, who was long dead. The book deals primarily with Bannon and his fascination with and implementation of Evola's ideas, as well as the network among other similarly minded thinkers that he has established, including Dugin and Carvalho. This list could also easily include the Hungarian traditionalist Tibor Varanyi, but Teitelbaum didn't talk to him. In the following selections, I compare both the logic of the two texts and the contents. I'm going to start with the logic. Okay, here I have attempted to diagram Evola's method because it's my primary basis for defining and comparing traditionalism in Evola and Ionescu. And as odd, random as it may seem to try to trace a similarity by a logical argument, let me assure you that this is a very particular argument, and it is a deployment, a specific deployment of what we now consider to be a logical fallacy in configuration with logic that we consider to be Platonic, meaning to say this argument has history and does not crop up in random places. So regarding his method, Evola writes, thus, what I call the traditional method is usually characterized by a double principle, ontologically and objectively by the principle of correspondence, that's important, which ensures an essential and functional correlation between analogous elements, presenting them as a simple homologous forms of the appearance of a central and unitary meaning, and epistemologically and subjectively by the generalized use of the principle of induction. He's not really inducing, which is here understood as a discursive approximation of a spiritual intuition. I'll explain that in a moment, in which what is realized is the integration and the unification of diverse elements encountered in the same one meaning and the same one principle. He continues, in this way, I will try to portray the sense of the world of tradition as a unity and as a universal type, capable of creating points of reference and of evaluation different from the ones to which the majority of the people in the West have passively and semi-consciously become accustomed. All right. So what you see in the lower left-hand corner is the collection of examples that Evola has assembled using his spiritual intuition. So these are examples of civilizations which exhibit an idea. And in this case, Evola makes this argument multiple times in order to adduce these traditional forms. I've just chosen the one that he uses to demonstrate the objective, transcendental, real, Platonic existence of cyclical declining ages of the world: gold, silver, bronze, followed by iron in this cycle of decay. This is the Hermetic correlation, which is step one of his argument. Because this aspect can be found in all of these examples that he adduces, he therefore concludes that it must have real, independent, objective reality in basically what amounts to the Platonic realm. Having done that, in the second part of Evola's method, we see that he creates both points of reference as a basis for evaluation, and a basis for evaluation. What that means is that he wants to enumerate aspects of the Platonic form of traditional civilization, which is larger than just the cyclical ages of the world. It also includes inherent hierarchies and divine kingships and all sorts of fun neo-medieval things. And he wants then to judge which of the existing civilizations here now on Earth comes closest to this transcendental ideal, basically adducing a Platonic form by distilling it out of examples chosen using spiritual intuition, and then measuring real civilizations against his distillate of an ideal. Spoiler alert, it's always Aryan civilization that comes out on top. Evola's methodological flim-flam consists of the fact that there's nothing other than his spiritual intuition to determine what he goes looking for in the first place. One can only assume that an esoteric fascist, given free rein to cherry-pick examples from all of history and mythology, based solely on his spiritual intuition, is going to produce a list of reference points that suggest the existence of transcendental esoteric fascism. It is, in my opinion, a Rube Goldberg machine of bias confirmation. The utility of this argument for Evola, as well as for Ionescu and for Dugin, is that it is an ontological argument, not just for the existence of God, like Anselm's famous ontological argument, or Aquinas's 5 ways, but for the existence of any transcendental form that is needed or desired. Given enough spiritual intuition, you could adduce the transcendental existence of the coffee filter, if you felt so inclined. Evola uses it to argue for the transcendental legitimacy of and ontological necessity of a caste system. Ionescu uses it to argue for the Romanian ethno-states, and Dugin uses it to argue for a Russian empire. Is it gonna let me? There we go. There are only a few slides that I'm going to read to you, but the next 3 are among them, so that you can see exactly what's going on here. Hermetic correlative adduction of universals. Inherent to the idea of traditional civilization is the idea of an equivalence or homology of its various forms realized in time and space. That means that transcendental, universal, Platonic ideals manifest throughout history in real space, in the world, and that in turn points to their existence outside of time and space. Now, Ionescu talking about legionary Romania, says, legionary Romania will be a political, economic, spiritual form of life that is different than that of today. The point of departure is history. Everything that happens, happens in time and space, that is, in history, or as the theologians say, in eternity. All right, then the deductive, Platonic deductive identification of the form in history. The overall spirit of a given civilization and the way it has concretely utilized all of the elements included in it will now become the relevant and specific object of my discussion. The synthetic consideration of the forces at work will replace my analysis, which had previously isolated the valid elements. This here's referring to his spiritual intuition guiding him to things to excavate from historical and mythological examples. I will attempt to discover the dominating factor within the various historical complexes and to determine the value of the different elements, not in an absolute and abstract way, but according to the action they exercise within a given civilization. So the overall spirit or the dominating factor that Evola means to adduce here is that of his own umbrella concept of tradition. That is cycles of the world, the caste system, holy wars, semi-divine kingships, and so on. All taken together, they are tradition. Now, conspicuously, Ionescu makes an analogous move to justify the overall spirit or dominating factor of his ideal civilization, not as traditional, but as legionary. Let us attempt to determine the historical profile of the epoch in which we find ourselves, starting from the affirmation that any given historical moment concerning an organic unity can be defined through a single constitutive element. This means that we can reveal the profile of the entire historical moment of today. Where, I wonder, did he find this affirmation that any given historical moment can be defined through a single constitutive element? Probably Evola. Okay, here we have the diagram of Ionescu's traditional method. This methodological parallel between Evola's revolt against the modern world and Ionescu's legionary phenomenon is evident. It is an unmistakably traditionalist argument. Step one, correlation implies causation, the familiar logical fallacy that I spoke about earlier, or for the enlatinated, cum hoc ergo propter hoc, this adduction of the universal forms, which is associated with Hermes Trismegistus, a mythical magus, wizard from prehistory, in the way that deductive reasoning is associated with Plato and inductive reasoning is associated with Aristotle. So for Ionescu, because feudalism, the Renaissance, Greek civilization, and Roman civilization all existed in time and space and exhibited varying degrees of characteristics as totalizing forms of life, we can assume the existence of totalizing forms, totalizing historical forms in eternity, meaning to say there's a Platonic form and this is it, and this is how things should be. Step two is the deduction that the universal or Platonic form will emerge from eternity into time and space in a particular Romanian form, as a sort of great Romanian empire. In other words, the only way for Romania to survive is to become totalizing like feudalism, the Renaissance, the Greek civilization, and the Roman civilization. It's worth noting that Ionescu's thesis at the University of Romania was an argument on the history of the ontological argument from Anselm of Canterbury forward. He literally collected proofs of transcendental truth throughout his life. So now we come to the comparison of the content of the argument. Evola and Ionescu associate the isms of modernity that most of us would, with modernity that most of us would. However, whereas we would probably seek to describe them in terms of chains of influences in history, Evola and Ionescu see them as symptoms of an underlying fatal condition. They relate these conditions to modernity in the way that the horsemen of the apocalypse, war, famine, pestilence, and death, relate to the end, the eschaton, in the book of Revelation. Humanism, Protestantism, individualism, the Enlightenment, the inductive reasoning of the scientific method, liberalism, democracy, dialectical materialism, and Marxism are understood as portents, harbingers of the end of the world. For traditionalists, modernity is not a periodization, but a force in itself. So I proceed to the point-for-point comparison of their associations of their framing of modernity in the next section. In this brief section, however, I want to show the functional commonalities of their respective revolts. So I subtitled this section A Tale of Two Crises in a reference to Roger Griffin's description of gnomic crisis. While the crisis of modernity is the same for both Evola and Ionescu, the anomie posed by it is not exactly the same. For Evola, the main threat seems to be the loss of social hierarchy, class, for Baron Julius Evola. For Ionescu, it seems to be the loss of national identity, Romanianness. As I will demonstrate a bit later on, this difference in focus is borne out in the comparison of the two texts. For Evola, these isms represent modernization. For Ionescu, they represent Westernization, which is part of modernization. Yet despite the different effects of the gnomic crisis, Evola and Ionescu offer the same corrective: the wholesale rejection of the aforementioned isms, the assertion of non-Aristotelian metaphysics, and an imperial social order. Evola proposes a new world order. Ionescu proposes a Romania that fits neatly into that new world order. In the section that follows, I begin the point-for-point comparison of Evola's and Ionescu's respective descriptions of the failures of civilization and what to do about it. First, however, I want to underscore the correctives they propose are the same: empires inside epistemological bubbles of correlative logic. Moreover, I want to stress that while Evola proposes the paradigmatic type, Ionescu represents a token example modeled after that type. In this slide, we see their epistemic bubble approach to truth. So I'm not going to read these, but they are there, and they will be in the article that will come out of this. In this slide, we see the type-token relationship once again. Evola proposes a spirit of universal civilization, by which he means not a single global empire, but any number of civilizations, all sharing the same fundamental metaphysical assumptions. Okay, now we come to the point-for-point comparison of the contents of the arguments. First, I will compare how they define modernity or Westernization. Then I will compare their correctives. Both attribute the same symptoms to modernity: evolutionism, materialism, scientific method, democracy, and pluralism. In the interest of time, I'm not going to read the comparisons, but rather quickly go through them, summarizing my basis for comparison. Both Evola and Ionescu reject evolutionism, by which they are referring to the possibility of dialectical or evolutionary improvement. So not the modern understanding evolution, but actually the sort of social evolution that has been disproven and argued against in the second half of the 20th century. For Evola and Ionescu, change can only be decline. In evolution, they are thus rejecting the possibility of improvement through novelty. Both reject materialism in favor of idealism, both citing Plato. Both reject the scientific method, inductive reasoning, Aristotelian reasoning, associated with materialism. Both Evola and Ionescu reject democracy as an inductive metaphysics of coercive authority. That is, they reject the idea of power flowing from below, from those governed, rather than from above, from God. Evola indirectly confronts this formulation, the formulation of this idea by his countryman, Marsilius of Padua, as articulated in Padua's Defensor Pacis from 1324. Both reject pluralism. However, the pluralism that they have in mind is metaphysical. According to Evola, race, however construed, may be associated with transcendental truth or not. Thus, certain different races may be able to live together, as Dugin proposes in his vision of Eurasia, while others may not. Oh dear. Good. Conversely, as with Ionescu, race alone may be insufficient for belonging. Ionescu says, I cannot be orthodox if I am capitalist, idealist, or nominalist, in philosophy, individualist, in ethics, or democratic in politics. If I am Protestant, it can be only thus, meaning you can be Romanian, but that may not be enough to live in the great Romanian Empire. Now, for their proposed correctives. It is not only the rejections or the negations of the isms that define the similarity between Evola's revolt and Ionescu's legionary phenomenon. It's also the similarities between the alternatives they present. In other words, it is not only the gnomic decline, but also, perhaps more so, the epistemological restoration, which suggests that Ionescu's legionary phenomenon is based on Evola's revolt. This section demonstrates those similarities. With both thinkers, evolutionism, historicism is replaced by relativity. Inductive reasoning and scientific method are replaced by Hermetic correlation. Materialist ontology is replaced by normality. Conformity to the transcendental conformity to the transcendental ideal form. Democracy is replaced by transcendental authority, in other words, the great chain of being. And pluralism is replaced by empire. As before, in the interest of time, I'm not going to linger on these comparisons. So conspicuously, both Evola and Ionescu propose relativity to describe the non-dialectal, non-causal relationship between successive civilizations in history. This constitutes their shared theory of history. They also have a shared theory of knowledge. That is one of the most conspicuous similarities between Evola and Ionescu. Both of them reject inductive reasoning, enlightenment reasoning, in favor of correlation, mentioned earlier. What Evola calls spiritual intuition, by the way, Ionescu refers to as personal art. Yes, here we have Ionescu's version of that. Normality is another especially conspicuous similarity between Evola and Ionescu because they use the same word. It is the answer to the problem or question of ontology. Both of them use it to refer to the sort of Platonic ideal which they divine through correlation and spiritual intuition, or what Ionescu calls personal art. In the Ionescu quote, he offers normality in the same way that Evola proposes unity as a universal type capable of creating points of reference and evaluation, which I mentioned earlier. So here we have the comparison of their theory of authority. It lines up neatly, but I won't linger. And here we have their ideas of empire, also very neatly lined up, but I don't have time to linger. All right, so Ionescu seems to line up very neatly with not only Evola's thought, but Evola's revolt against the modern world, with a few exceptions, but one major exception, which is where Evola says that the decline of the West is incidental, could have happened anywhere. Ionescu says, no, the West was destined to decline, and the East, by virtue of its historical and geographic conditions, is destined for greatness if it would but reject the temptations of the West and modernity. This is the similarity with Dugin that I mentioned earlier. All right. So here we have an example of Dugin mentioning Russia's own special truth. This, I mean, to compare to the epistemic bubble for the Eurasian empire that he proposes. In the interview, he even says that truth is relative in the same way that Ionescu does, relative within history, but absolute within the collective. Meaning, if you're Russian, you have to accept Russian truth, even though someone else may have a different truth. So inside the bubble, absolute. Now to the question of Dugin's method. Here we have Dugin's version of what Evola calls the traditional method in the question of spiritual intuition. So Evola's version of the traditional method is the most developed. He uses it over and over again over the course of his book to create a laundry list of things that constitute traditional civilization. Ionescu mostly uses it once to suggest that the idea of a great Romanian empire existing outside of time and space, ready to be birthed into reality, that is a legitimate idea. Dugin uses it to adduce the fourth political theory. He says, so there are ideologies, and they have commonalities as ideologies. And what is it that they do in common? And at times he connects this to Dasein and this idea of authentic existence. But while he starts with three ideologies, he strikes liberalism from the list at the end of modernity and says, as soon as liberalism became the only ideology, it was no longer an ideology. So now we have nothing, no ideology, no authentic ideology with which to fight back the decline of post-modernity. So he's trying to distill, in effect, his fourth ideology from communism and fascism, although he doesn't come right out and say that. But he does the same sort of thing, this Hermetic move to locate the Platonic ideal, and the Platonic deductive move to say it must exist. The fact that his list is shorter, I can only suppose, has to do with a lack of spiritual intuition. So here we have Ionescu's screed on the geographic determinism of historical forms of life. I won't read, it's there. And then this bit of Dugin's version of that. I've lifted this beautifully succinct quote from John Mosby, a scholar of political theology, who drew this from Dugin's From Sacred Geography to Sacred Politics. Mosby writes, Dugin continually contrasts the Western secular approach to geopolitical questions with his metaphysical beliefs. He continues, geopoliticians, well, you can read this, stared at the fact of a fundamental difference between insular and continental powers, between Western progressive civilization and Eastern despotic and archaic cultural forms, and missed a critical element. Because for Western geopoliticians, the question about spirit in its metaphysical and sacred comprehension never arose in modern science. They left it aside, says Dugin. Western geopoliticians prefer to evaluate the situation in different, more modern terms, rather than through the concepts of sacred and profane, shouting out to Mircea Eliade there, and traditional and anti-traditional, shouting out to Evola there. Evola was unmistakably fighting modernity. Ionescu seems to have primarily concerned himself with Westernization. Dugin seems concerned with both nomic crises, but like Evola and Ionescu, he proposes an empire in an, albeit very large, epistemic bubble as his solution. So, conclusions. Excuse me. I make so bold at this point as to say, yes, the legionary phenomenon, to all of the criteria that I can hold it to, seems very much to be lifted from Evola's revolt against the modern world, which means that it is an unrecognized piece of the body of traditionalist literature, and that it is very like Dugin's approach to traditionalism, where Dugin has previously been considered an outlier. He now has friends. And the last one is further implications, and I'm going to unshare here in a moment and say that it drags Eliade and the relationship of tradition and Eastern Orthodoxy into the frame. All right, thank you so much.
Oops. Okay, I have to start my video as well. Thank you so much, Jason. That was a lot.
Yeah, well, it's basically a draft of the article, but there are those who will disagree with what I'm saying, and I wanted to, since this is going to live on the internet, put an ironclad version out there. So yeah, Adam Hansel, our graduate student, was kind enough to listen to me give part of this and predicted the question that Dr. Neuberger was going to ask. So I just want you to know before you claim your rights as for the first question, know that there's money riding on it, Dr. Neuberger.
Wait a minute. I want to hear what he thinks I'm going to ask.
You think you can do it, Adam? I thought it was a good question. I wasn't sure it would be the one that.
Yeah, I want to hear what Adam's version of what he thinks I'm going to say, because it's probably a good question.
It was definitely a good question. I had to think about it.
I literally just deleted my notes. So, yeah, if there's money on it, I mean, go ahead, Dr. Neuberger.
It was a question about basically how all of them are intervening into the question of history and how we think of history. And I can't recall much more about it. Basically, where I think it was, where does Evola break history and insert his non-historical intervention? Particularly because how do you claim to be anti-modern if you're going to be if you're going to reject periodicity, right? So
I wasn't going to ask that, but I was thinking about that as one possible thing to ask. But that was more along the lines of thinking, like, it's interesting how we think of this school of thought as traditionalism, and where, you know, these thinkers kind of invoke tradition, but in a sense, what they're proposing is not tradition at all.
Oh no, not
yeah,
even
it's
remotely.
Something completely new. Yeah.
At least with these guys, yeah. I mean, they're using their spiritual intuition to cherry pick examples of the society they would like to live in. And what I found is that Evola says, I want to be, you know, I want people to curtsy when they meet me in the street because I'm Baron Evola, or at least he claimed to be. And Ionescu was historically, in our version of history, is worried about the sort of the Romanian identity being subsumed into a kind of westernization. The whole, sorry Keith, Francophonie, I think, although Ionescu himself, in his lovely and well-appointed villa, as was pointed out by some of his contemporaries, was very westernized. He made enough money to do that by bemoaning the westernization of Romania. So, yeah.
Right. Well, so okay, so I wasn't going to ask that, but instead, I guess I'm just thinking like I guess maybe thinking like a historian here, but thinking of a couple of bigger picture questions that I know aren't like, you're so down in the weeds with the nitty-gritty of these ideas. So this is going to be like pulling back a little bit. But I guess one is, how do these fit into the kind of larger trajectory of anti-modernist, ideas that were, global, I guess you could say, coming from the West itself, but maybe arguably having particular strength outside the West. And then why have they been so powerful at particular moments? And it seems to be like, interwar Europe and wartime Europe, but also today. And what kinds of, insecurities, or, I guess in some cases, these ideas have purchased among people who are kind of the losers of those very kind of modern isms, or see themselves as the losers of modernity and therefore lash out at it as kind of the problem. Those are just like enormous questions, but thinking about those or focusing in on the Balkans, just thought I would throw those your way.
Thank you. They are great questions, and they're sort of the holy grail of the whole the whole question of studying traditionalism and soft traditionalism. And this, by the way, is very much what Marlene Laruelle is engaged in, and at various times Andreas Umland and Anton Shevtsov have been engaging with this part of Dugin's thinking. There is a resurgence of it. So the question, if I can be permitted to translate it, is, or to paraphrase it, is why do people believe this at all? And why do they seem to believe it in waves? That's the, so it is the Holy Grail. I will say I have my own sorts of theories and suspicions. I relate it in my mind to gnomic crisis and grasping at straws. So when social order begins to break down, there is a for a long time in the history of Russia and Russian Orthodoxy, people tried to attribute the raskol, the schism, and what seemed like, under the microscope, really modest reforms of the difference between making the sign of cross this way, and whether you process around the church clockwise or counterclockwise, whether these were such a big deal or somehow stood in for something else. And it's only been through decades of iterative scholarship that people have said it is potentially part of a gnomic crisis, right? So that it is the straw that breaks the camel's back, or that people will latch on to things and attribute more meaning than we normally would to them under times of pressure. So I haven't falsified that all the way through history in my mind, but I would say if that's true, then it's terrifying, because the more tumult that we have, then the more nonsense people are going to be prepared to believe. And I think this is my big hypothesis, that Dugin and Bannon and Evola and the evangelical right movers and shakers who are influencing Congress are onto this. And so they don't even really have to be working together. They just have to be giving an information overload. And then with that, people will latch on to something that they can mentally map. Now that's overly simplified and not particularly well argued, but that is sort of my tentative hypothesis in response to your question, Mary, which I am actively thinking about.
Well, I guess the other terrifying part about that is just the fact that democracy is not functioning particularly well right now in the United States because it's being blocked by certain party in this country. And so then that adds fuel to the fire, like democracy, liberalism, like those don't work. They don't work for me,
Let's go back to a divine monarchy so that we can get something done. And there seems to be people getting on that bus.
Well, Stephen has a great question in the chat. I know Carlos has one too, but Stephen, do you want to first ask your question? Or are you needing to take off for another event?
I can ask it. It's going to be about 90 seconds. Jason, thanks for this great talk. I really enjoyed it. I was thinking about a book that I remember reading when I was a grad student by Tim McDaniel called The Agony of the Russian Idea. And it was a really interesting book because it came at a moment in time in the 1990s when there was so much crisis, and this was pre-Dugin. But I think sometimes of Dugin reading more and more of his texts that seem so cherry-picked and performative, as you say, that there has to be a kind of history to this mimicry and borrowing. And I'm wondering if you might say, having worked in German literature and in Romanian literature as well, if you see these philosophical elements, metaphysics, epistemology, and so forth as traditional too, or if you think that in the writing, he, especially Dugin, seems to be doing something new. And I'll listen to this. Thanks.
Okay, great. Is Dugin, let me work backwards. Is Dugin doing something new vis-a-vis tradition? With time, I would press you to see what you mean about tradition. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to kind of make two guesses and say that it is important when we're talking about traditionalism, capital T, and talking about Evola and his predecessor, Ganon, whether we're talking about the South American traditionalists, including Olavo de Carvalho, and I believe Miguel Serrano, I think it is. These are, they're calling this traditionalism or integral tradition, and what they mean is transcendental, enforceable reality. So don't confuse or conflate it with an actual sense of tradition, even in the sense of like the creation of tradition or the invention of tradition, in the various ways that tradition may or may not be real or a thing. These thinkers are different in the sense that they are literally opening a window in time and space, reaching through and attempting to birth Platonic forms. So they mean something very different than what we would talk about in a real historiographical context. That said, this idea of emergent Platonic forms has its own history as an idea, and it has been around since. This is why it matters that I did my PhD in Germanic studies and am a forensic theologian of sorts, because this goes back to the Renaissance, the court of Cosimo de' Medici, who had Marsilio Ficino translate the Corpus Hermeticum and the works of Plato into Latin. So this all comes into the East in the 1470s out of Greece in the form of the Asclepius. This is the first text. This is ground zero for this idea of as above, so below, as within, so without. It's this magical thinking of correspondences that spreads out into multiple traditions, including, I believe, into one that our own Dr. Alexandrova is interested in. That would be theosophy. And Guénon, in fact, engaged in a sort of polemical wizard's duel with Madame Blavatsky for writing nasty open letters about how theosophy was a giant fraud, although apparently he kind of grew out of that as well. So this correlative reasoning has been lingering forever. It's part of the Masonic tradition. So that what is interesting is how such a Western idea has found its way into Romania when it did, and whether Dugin got it out of Romania and is lying about where he got it. Of course, the thing about tradition is it claims to be a transcendental truth. So nobody can possibly actually be plagiarizing it. They're just better at recognizing the truth. So,
Thanks, Jason. I hadn't thought of it that way at all. Dugin is achieving the transcendence that no other mortal can reach. Thank you.
Well, that's certainly the claim. And in Roger Griffin's formation of this, along with the gnomic crisis, is the propheta, the one who proposes the solution. So, and the prophecy that offers the solution. So I would say Evola, Ionescu, and Dugin place themselves in this position, given the emergence of a gnomic crisis. It's sort of like the demagogue, but this is your moment to offer a new metaphysic, a new epistemology, and they keep offering the same anti-modern, anti-inductive version of this. So,
All right,
thanks.
Let's go to Carlos Amador for your question.
Hi, Jason. Thank you. And
Hey,
thank
Carlos.
you for name dropping two of my pet thinkers. This might be a real outside, not pet, like I want to hang out with them in that kind of like.
Carlos is talking about Olavo de Carvalho and Miguel.
No, I was just like, as we were talking, okay, so this might be a little inside baseball. And if it is, please feel free to dismiss it. But I'm trying to parse out some of the ways traditionalism gets manufactured or reconfigured in South American the vernacular, right? I'm thinking Olavo de Carvalho and Miguel Serrano. The thing that
Brazilian accent is way better than mine.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's why I get paid the medium bucks. The one thing that they seem to share is a sense of Carvalho and Serrano is a sense of the absolute kind of failure of religious plenitude, right? The institution of the Catholic Church is, and I need to relook at this in Carvalho, so I'm going to speak for Serrano. The churches are gone. They lack a kind of specific value to bring in the new world. So I'm wondering how the tradition, how Ionescu, why would they go back? If you can maybe this is a hypothesis, why would they still ground themselves in a kind of religiosity that is institutionally at the same time working with modernizing forces, countering modernizing forces, where the church is a kind of radical political, a mobile political institution. And so in Chile, at least, Serrano poo-poos it and would like it completely off the map, recognizing it's hard to get it off the map. He nonetheless wants a kind of Hitlerism, right? He wants everything to be come to the kind of Kali Yuga, destruction of everything in the form of what Serrano calls Hitler, the ultimate avatar. Carvalho wants it's still hard for me to parse what exactly Carvalho wants with respect to the local churches. So I'm wondering if you could give me some indication of why it's still compelling. This is my question. Thank you. Why is it still compelling to invoke the Russian or the Romanian Orthodox Church in the moment of modernization or crisis of modernity, and especially when neither church seems to me to have a kind of like ultra-montanist bent as a way that the Catholic Church did, where it was like, part of the thing Vatican I was full-blown, the Catholic Church bemoans modernity, if that makes sense. Like, why go back to the
I think it does. Okay.
Thank
this
you.
is it's a great question. It's a spot where I'm presently excavating And in my last slide, where I mention how this sort of drags Eliade into the frame and the difference between Evola being part of a Catholic culture and the structure of the Catholic Church being imperial, and Ionescu and Dugin being part of Orthodox culture. And I'm not connecting this to catechesis and theology, not directly at least. I'm saying it has to do with cultural identity. So it also has, so it's a question of not what must Orthodoxy do, what must Catholicism do, but how can Orthodoxy as a social structure be co-opted by Dugin and Ionescu? And I think that's the question that we have to ask here. There's another question at work that is a Catholic versus Orthodox question, and this has to do with, if you'll recall me referencing how Evola takes a swipe at his countryman Marsilius of Padua, who wrote in 1324 the Defensor Pacis, the Defender of the Peace. The text is famous in that what it does is sort of break the great chain of being in the West. So in 1302, I believe it is, we get the papal bull Unam Sanctam from Boniface VIII. See how I'm doing, Mary? This is history, right? who is citing the great chain of being to say God, Pope, Emperor, and so on, right? And it's Marsilius of Padua who invokes Aristotle to suggest for the first time the legitimacy of the governed, of governance comes from the governed, not from above. This never happened in Orthodoxy, right? There is no Orthodox Aquinas. So this whole idea of church and state separation that comes about gradually through the Reformation and these various arguments was never part of the Orthodox theological imaginary, right? The imaginary is that the ideal is this thing that we call Byzantine Symphonia, which is a perfect balance of temporal and spiritual power in which the emperor and the patriarch are perfect co-equals, and they always get along and they always agree. And the emperor is a good Christian and goes to church, and the patriarch is a good citizen and follows all the laws. And so that's Symphonia, and that's the ideal, as opposed to the separation of powers. The idea remains this pre-modern Platonic other version. So where the Pope was trying to be above the emperor, the Orthodox solution to this balance of power was always different and has kind of never officially changed. The current statement from the Russian Orthodox Church says some version of course that would be better, but for lots of reasons we can't do that. But they're still saying, of course that would be better. So why have a sort of co-belligerent relationship, if, or at least why rhetorically conscript orthodoxy into your screed as a traditionalist? Well, it's because it is a Platonic great chain of being worldview that easily fits into the second half of the traditionalist method. So where you don't have the correlative Hermetic adduction of these various forms, you still, in Orthodoxy, have a framework in which universal truths should absolutely dictate top-down policy, for lack of a better word, morality, policy, etc. So there's I keep seeing traces, I keep like feeling a disturbance in the force around differences between Catholic imperial traditionalism and Orthodox versions of this.
I have to get going for another meeting, but just to give you a piece of that, Olavo de Carvalho has a book on Aristotle, which I had just discovered it recently, and it's on its way to my hands right now. But it's very much framed as a kind of rereading of Aristotle through the astrological traditionalist strange lens that G. Carvalho has. So I don't know what the takeaway is from that, but it is notable to recognize that one of the most well-read, I mean, he's immensely popular right-wing thinkers in the Lusophone and his sphere is engaging directly with Aristotle, and I never make those connections. So thank you so much for a magnificent talk. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Carlos.
Thank you for everybody.
Thanks, Carlos. It looks like Keith Wagner has a question.
Thank you. Thank you, Jason, for this. It was so fascinating. I will definitely have to rewatch on YouTube just to get all the notes I want to. Anyways, so I want to say that I love the term that you used, epistemic bubble. Definitely has great relevance. And for another reason, for terminology, I just love that you said methodological flim-flam. Just so you can make us laugh and enlighten us at the same time. So for a question, so I'm wondering about this concept of the overall spirit that you talked about. And I've come across a couple of works. I'm going to pop their names in the chat. One is by Mircea Eliade, an essay called Destinul Culturii Românești. And then Emil Cioran wrote something called Transfiguration de la Roumanie. I've heard these, at least the Cioran, being lumped into a like search for Romanian specificity. But I just want to ask you if you see these as influenced by Ionescu, and if they're sort of trying to make that argument about the Romanian spirit, that sort of a thing.
Are there any Romanians still in the Zoom with us? I can't call on any. Well, Valentina is there, but no, I would be remiss in not pointing out specifically that Eliade and Cioran are members of the so-called young generation who were student sycophants of Nae Ionescu. So when I say that this potentially brings Eliade into, or drags Eliade into the frame for the conversation, is part of the larger book project, is a re-examination of Eliade's theories of religion and theories generally as potential continuations of the project, of the epistemological project that are blowing up the bubble that Ionescu sets up here. So Eliade's ideas map on to what Ionescu is saying we need to have in order to have a great Romanian empire, along with other empires. Like, I can't stress enough that the model here is not a one world Romania. It is a one world consensus metaphysics in which every government is this kind of government doing their own thing with their own coexistence of religion and race and whatever else seems to matter to them, right? So it's that kind of homogeneity that we're talking about. We know that Cioran was, as Sergio calls him, the saddest boy. He wrote this sort of introspective, melancholic, blank verse philosophical poetry, and seems to have had a really hard time with his own past and with his relationship to Nae and the others. I have a short history of decay, and I'm reading it slowly. Although decay, it's been there the whole time. The decline of the West, the decadence, the decay, it might very well be a meditation on the decline of the West. In fact, Mihail Sebastian, who was also one of the students of Nae Ionescu, and who was also one of the young generation, in his journal calls out Nae Ionescu for plagiarizing Oswald Spengler, who wrote The Decline of the West, Untergang des Abendlandes. So we know that Ionescu was rhapsodizing on this theme in his class to these people. So yeah, now you've just added to my bibliography. I have to read that. I would say yes, as far as I know, they are all concerned with this project of what is Romania. And there's a book that has come out recently. I'm ashamed that I can't recall the name of it quickly, but I'll give it to you the next time I see you, that deals with a whole group of intellectuals trying to figure out how to cobble together a Romanian national identity in the face of this Frankification, is that what it's called? The French influence that was happening at the time that you're studying. So it's the blowback against all of the Francophonie and the French dress and the French layout to the new apartments and the French architecture and the French food and of course the Jews and the banks and all of the other stuff that they see happening to Romanianness.
We're kind of wrapping up here, but just one last comment about what sort of part of what you were just saying. Is it's interesting that this model allows both for kind of a hyper-nationalist vision and a kind of international universalist kind of, sort of, well, fascism for lack of a better term, but connections between these various hyper-nationalist fascist groups to kind of flourish, for them to sort of support each other. And that's, obviously translated into today's kind of networks of global
Right. Well,
fascists.
we see that with, that's the utopia that Dugin promises with Eurasianism for all of the traditional peoples and traditional confessions of Eurasia, right? So the Buddhists that have always been there will get along with the Orthodox who have always been there, as long as they don't start acting any different or wanting anything different, basically, as long as everybody stays in their lane. We don't need any new lanes, but we also don't need any fewer lanes. So maintain the sort of metaphysical worldview. It's also, I think, part of what we see in like the Catholic evangelical co-belligerence around the Supreme Court and abortion, and why you have Catholics who 40 years ago were social justice warriors by like creed almost, now changing very much their position. So it's a metaphysic, right? Sort of a metaphysical commonality, a substratum of sameness is how I'm thinking about it. I think you nailed it, Mary.
Well, I think all of this is really important to understand, both in the Balkan context, but also how that context has influenced others, as you've shown, has been influenced by others and in turn influences others.
UNESCO
So thank you.
Regaining popularity in Romania.
Well, thank you for this wonderful talk, and thank you everyone for coming. So
Thank
that
you.
concludes our Balkan Circle today. Hope to see many of you next week.
Thank you.